Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolutely fascinating intersection of geopolitics and sports to answer one massive question. Exactly why did 65 nations boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics? We're going to look at a truly pivotal moment when the running track and the football pitch literally became the front lines of the Cold War. Let's kick things off with a modern quote from UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres that beautifully captures the Olympic ideal. He stated, "The Olympics are an excellent moment to symbolize peace and respect for international law and international cooperation." And, we really do like to think of the Games as a sanctuary from global conflict, right? A rare moment where international cooperation temporarily eclipses all those geopolitical tensions.
But history shows us that this sanctuary isn't always respected. So what happens when that ideal is just shattered? What happens when athletes become pawns on a geopolitical chessboard? Well, to figure that out, we have to travel back to the end of the 1970s.
Section 1. The Soviet Invasion Catalyst. To understand the root cause of the boycott, we have to look at the high-stakes Cold War politics that ignited the whole thing. In late 1979 and early 1980, a super rapid succession of military events set the stage for a massive global showdown. Right around Christmas Eve of '79, Soviet airborne troops landed in Kabul, Afghanistan. And within days, literally days, the Afghan president was assassinated, a Soviet-backed leader was installed, and the international community was just sent reeling. By early January, U.S. President Jimmy Carter proposed an Olympic boycott, making it official American policy by March. The sheer scale of the panic this invasion caused in the West was immense. U.S. policymakers viewed the deployment of over 100,000 Soviet troops not just as some localized conflict, but as a really severe threat to post-World War II global stability. There were genuine fears that this expansionist aggression could bleed into neighboring Pakistan and ultimately cut off the incredibly vital Persian Gulf oil routes.
Section 2. Carter's symbolic weapon. This brings us to the actual diplomatic mechanism chosen to combat the crisis.
So, how does a superpower respond when direct military conflict with a nuclear rival is completely off the table? President Jimmy Carter, heavily advised by folks like National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, recognized that military action was just way too risky. So instead, they turned to the upcoming Olympics to publicly embarrass the Soviet Union and impose severe diplomatic costs on the global stage.
The Carter administration had already tried things like grain embargoes and suspending technology transfers, but those past economic and diplomatic sanctions had totally failed to force a Soviet withdrawal. Because of this, the boycott was explicitly designed as a highly visible symbolic weapon. The Soviet Union had spent billions of rubles preparing to host their very first Olympic Games just to prove their global legitimacy. So the U.S. strategy was to completely strip Moscow of that prestige.
Section 3. 65 nations stay home. Carter didn't just want the United States to stay home. He wanted the whole world to join them. 65. That is the staggering number of nations that ultimately joined the American-led boycott. Through immense diplomatic pressure, key allies like West Germany, Canada, Japan, and Israel all agreed to keep their athletes at home to send one incredibly unified message. This absolutely fractured the international community. The boycott slashed the attendee list from a projected 121 nations down to just 80. This massive reduction fundamentally altered the competitive landscape of the Games, essentially removing major sporting powerhouses from almost every single discipline. Section 4. The Altered Moscow Games. Despite the massive absence, the show in Moscow went on, creating this really fascinating duality. There was such a stark contrast in how the event was broadcast globally. From the Western perspective, this was a fractured, completely delegitimized Olympics. But the Soviet propaganda machine carefully ignored the boycott entirely. Domestically, they painted a picture of a glowing, unified global event, boasting that the Olympic Village was fully stocked with Western brands like Puma and Adidas, and highlighting that 4,800 posters from 45 different countries were submitted for the Games. Section 5. Impact on Olympic football. To truly understand the collateral damage of this boycott, we need to zoom in on the visceral reality of the athletes. The competitive field was completely scrambled. 7 qualified football teams withdrew. To keep the 16-team format alive, organizers really had to scramble for last-minute invitees. Football powerhouses like Argentina and the United States were suddenly replaced by teams like Venezuela and Cuba, teams that honestly just lacked the same international pedigree, dramatically tilting the competitive balance.
And adding to the imbalance, the absence of Western talent left the tournament to be completely dominated by Eastern Bloc teams, taking advantage of an absolutely massive loophole. At the time, the Olympics were strictly for amateurs, but the Eastern Bloc utilized state amateurs, athletes nominally listed as military or factory workers, but who were entirely funded by the state to train full-time, exactly like professionals. With the top Western amateurs gone, these highly seasoned, state-sponsored squads just steamrolled the competition. This grounded reality was perfectly captured during the gold medal match. French sports commentators broadcasting the final between Czechoslovakia and East Germany noted the pouring rain and gray skies over Luzhniki Stadium. They described an incredibly rough physical game of attrition between two state-sponsored giants, filled with constant fouls, resulting in 0 goals in the entire first half. Ultimately, Czechoslovakia claimed their first Olympic football gold with a 1-0 victory, while the Soviet Union took bronze. But Western critics were really quick to argue that while the medals were real, the victory was heavily diluted by the artificially weakened international field. It simply didn't represent the true pinnacle of global sports. Section 6. The boycott's geopolitical legacy. Finally, we must zoom back out and ask, did this monumental collision between sports and politics actually work? Well, if the primary objective was to force an immediate Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the boycott was a complete failure. The games concluded, but the military occupation persisted. In fact, Soviet forces wouldn't fully withdraw from Afghanistan until February of 1989, nearly a decade later, and long after Jimmy Carter had left office. Instead of resolving the conflict, the boycott merely sparked a bitter cycle of retaliation. 4 years later, claiming security concerns and anti-Soviet hysteria, the USSR and 13 other Eastern Bloc nations orchestrated a reciprocal boycott of the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. This deeply polarized the international community and severely damaged the Olympic movement for an entire decade. Which leaves us with one final provocative question. We know the 65-nation boycott failed to change Soviet military policy, but it certainly succeeded in crushing the dreams of thousands of athletes. So, was a purely symbolic political gesture worth the unrecoverable sacrifice of athletes who trained their whole lives only to never get their chance to compete? I'll leave you to ponder that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.